Let's do it. So we're holding Daf Chof Abed Beis, the beginning of the third chapter. We're holding by the Mishnah, and we're going to be discussing how there are certain stringencies, which later on in the Gemara, it's going to call them malos. Malos is synonymous in the Gemara over here with chumros, which are stringencies that the Chachamim imposed upon the precautionary measures we need to take with regards to different items, depending on whether they're going to be used for a lower level of Kedusha or a higher level of Kedusha. So in the Mishnah, we're going to be contrasting two levels, the level of Truma versus the level of Kodesh. Okay, so so here we have somebody else joining. Okay, so let's start the Mishnah. The stringency of Kodesh over Truma is, again, we said that Kodesh means things that are sacrifices, the meats of a sacrifice. So a person has to be at a particular level of tahara, of purity, before he can eat Kodesh. Okay, so now I just want to mention that everything that we're discussing over here is midrabanan. Okay, this is not the Raisa. Obviously, if it's we're talking about something that somebody has contracted Tumah Raisa, then you have to go to mikvah. There's not even a question. But here we're talking about where there's an issue where the Chachamim were the ones who came along and said that by coming into contact with this particular thing, that you now become ineligible to be able to deal with Truma or Kodshim. Okay, so when we have the stringencies of Kodesh over Truma, Shemat Bilin Kailin B'toich Kailin L'Truma, you can immerse a vessel within another vessel if you're going to be using it for Truma, which means like this. There's two ways to understand this. There's one way to understand this, the way Rashi does it, is that you want to tovel a vessel, and you have another smaller vessel that you also want to immerse into the mikvah. And you decide, I'll do both of them together. I'll put one in, and I'll put the other one inside the first one, and this way, I'll get both of them done in one shot. So, according to our Mishnah, that's okay for Truma. It's not okay for Kodesh. And we'll see, the reason is because of chatzitza. We're worried that there's going to be an interposition. There's going to be something that separates the water from being able to touch every part of the vessel. The way the Rambam understands this is that actually we're talking about a basket or a vessel that was used to tovel other kalim in, to immerse. In other words, I don't know if you've ever gone to local mikvahs where you can go and tovel your kalim. What many places have is a basket, and you put all the things that you want to tovel, you put it in that basket, and then you lower it in, and this way you have all your things getting done at once. So the question is whether you could use that kind of a thing in order to be able to immerse your vessels in. And the Rambam says that the Mishnah over here is saying that you can do that for Truma, but not for Kodesh. And that the reason is because we're worried about the weight of one vessel on top of the other, which will not allow the water to move everywhere. Now, obviously, this isn't an actual chatzitza, because if it were an actual chatzitza, why would it work for Truma as well? But what we're saying over here is we are placing an extra stringency that perhaps it could be heavy, and if it could be heavy, perhaps it might not get everywhere. Although generally speaking, we would say it could still get through, despite it being inside of another. In fact, if you when you put something into the water, what happens usually is that the one inside of the other begins to float because of the water that comes in. But we're saying there's an extra stringency when it comes to Kodesh over Truma. You can't do that. Okay, now the next stringency is Achurayim v'toich oveshat tzvita b'truma. When we talk about the outside of the vessel, the inside of the vessel, and the tzvita place, which is the the handle, right? They're all considered to be separate vessels with regards to truma, but not with regards to kodesh. What does that mean? That means that although when it comes to a deraisa level of tuma, right? If one part of the vessel becomes impure, it's the entire vessel becomes pure in most cases, right? So here, when it comes to a derabanan, the rabbis came along and said that, you know what? Yes, we make an extra stringency that it becomes tamei, it becomes contaminated, but only the part that came into contact with the tumah. So if the outside, for example, or the inside or the handle became tamei, it's only that part that becomes tamei. The other part doesn't become tamei. That's with regards to truma. Not with regards to kodesh. As far as kodesh is concerned, the rabbis say that this extra stringency that we made, right, that it should become tamei, would apply to the entire vessel when it comes to kodesh. The next thing is hanoises a midras, somebody who's carrying a midras, which means, for example, you have a zav. A zav is metame. It's able to make something tamei to the level of rishon, right? Now, if he is wearing his shoes, for example, now he's pressed down on his shoes. Those shoes become a rishon l'tumah. Now you can carry that shoe, and at the same time, noises atruma, you can carry with the other hand, you can carry a barrel of truma, right? Now, if you look in Rashi, says bechavis, talking about a barrel, but I think there's a Hagah over here on the side that is talking about bechavis shel cheres. It's talking about an earthenware kli, the vessel, which is a barrel, which is earthenware. Why is that important to note? Because earthenware vessels have a special law that if it becomes tamei on the outside, it doesn't become tamei on the inside. Okay. An earthenware vessel, if it comes tamei on the outside, it doesn't become tamei on the inside. So we're saying that when you're carrying a shoe, which is a midras l'tumah, right? If you're carrying that in one hand, you can still come and carry in the other hand this barrel of wine, right? That is truma, because it's in an earthenware vessel, and we're not worried about the two mixing up and passing truma from one to the other. However, that's not the case with kodesh. With kodesh, you cannot do that. The next thing is bigdei oichle truma, midras lekodesh. This we already mentioned before, that when you have the garments of somebody who is careful only to the level of truma, so his garment becomes a midras to somebody who is careful for kodesh. So somebody who's going to eat kodesh, who bumped into somebody who's only careful with truma, then he has to go and immerse himself again to be able to eat kodesh. Now, the next thing we say is loy midas hakodesh midas hatruma. The rule of kodesh is not the same as the rule with regard to truma. In other words, with regards to the laws of chatzitza, we're not going to apply the same stringencies that we do with kodesh to truma. And here we're going to enumerate a couple of examples. Number one, kodesh, when it comes to kodesh, matir, if there's a knot, you have to untie the knot. And we're not talking about a tight knot that no water can get in at whatsoever. We're talking about a loose knot over here. Nevertheless, you've got to undo that knot. Umanage, and you've got to dry the garment if it was wet, for the same reason, because we're worried that the water on it right now is going to be a chatzitza. And and you have to then dry it. So you have to untie it. You have to dry the garment if it's wet, and matbil, then you immerse it, and then you only afterwards can you tie it. So, for example, if you have, let's say, a garment or whatever it might be, that the style that it needs to be is one that it has knots in it, you cannot tovel it while it has that knot, even if it's a loose knot. You have to untie it. You have to make sure that it's dry, and then you can immerse it. And then if you want to tie a knot afterwards, you can tie a knot afterwards, no problem. But ubitruma, when it comes to truma, not only do you not need to untie a loose knot if it's there, we go even further. We say kosher. You can even tie a loose knot if you want before immersing it. And afterwards you can immerse it, no problem. The next stringency that we see that we have applying to kodesh but not applying to truma is as follows: kalim hanigmorim b'tahara. If you have vessels that they were completed in their making in a state of tahara, which means to say as follows: any vessel that is not completed in making it does not contract any tumah. Why? Because it's not yet a vessel, and since it's not yet a vessel, it's not kosher. And since it's not kosher, the law is it doesn't contract any tumah. However, what if a person comes along and says, I want to use this cup that I'm making right now. I want to use it for kodesh, right? If I want to use it for kodesh, even though I just before finishing making the cup have in mind to be careful from this point on that at this point it's going to become kosher, and so therefore I'm going to protect it from any tumah, right? Nevertheless, I still have to immerse it into the mikvah, right? So, tzrichen tefillah l'kodesh, the Mishnah says, it requires a immersion in the mikvah for kodesh, avol, but not avolei l'truma. You would not require that for truma. Why not? Because the truth of the matter is, it never becomes what? It never becomes tamei, because once you finished making it, you already had intention to protect it from tumah, and it only becomes susceptible to tumah. It only becomes susceptible to tumah from the point where it becomes a keli. So if that's the case, so then why by kodesh is it a problem? So it seems that what we're concerned about, if you remember the stories from yesterday, we said about the woman who she said that she didn't have in mind when she was making the garment, right? That to protect it from tahara, even though she herself was tahara from when she made it. We explained the scenario was that the string snapped. She then tied a knot with her mouth. There was a bit of wetness from her mouth that was attached to the string, and therefore, although the garment only becomes susceptible to tumah once it becomes a garment of 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, but nevertheless, since the string may have remained wet from before, that wetness now makes the whole garment tummy. So we're saying that we don't have this far stretched concern with regards to truma, but we will be extra stringent when it comes to kodesh and say maybe the guy who was making this vessel was very careful at the end of making the vessel to make sure that it doesn't come into contact with any tumah, but maybe prior to that, there was some wetness that was applied to this vessel, which remained there after the completion of making the vessel, and now that could then make the whole vessel tummy. So we have that far concern with regards to kodesh, but not with regards to truma. Okay, next one. So here's the story with this one. You have a vessel. Inside that basket, let's say, you have this a bunch of small pieces of fruit or big pieces of fruit, whatever it is, but there are lots of separate pieces. Now, we say with regards to kodesh, the vessel now combines all of the things that are in it to make them all considered one. And so therefore, if you touch one piece of fruit inside this basket and that becomes tamei, the rest of the contents inside that basket also become tamei with regards to kodesh. Avolei truma, we don't say that with regards to truma. We say with regards to truma, only the thing that you touch becomes tamei, but the other one doesn't become. Anything else doesn't become tamei. The next thing we mentioned is haravi'i b'kodesh pasol, that we mentioned this before, that there are different levels of how far something can pass on the tumah. So with regards to kodesh, we say that a revi, a fourth stage removed from the original tumah, can now become puzzle with regards to kodesh, but v'hashlishi b'truma, it's only the shlishi that becomes unfit in the case of truma. Ubetruma, and another difference between truma and kodesh is as follows: that if one of your hands become tamei with regards to eating truma, and we're talking about something that you only become tamei midrabanan, because as far as tumah da'iraisa is concerned, there's no difference between your hand and the rest of your body. Once your hand contracts any tumah mid'iraisa, then your whole body becomes tamei, and you have to go to mikvah. Whereas with the chachamim, we're saying that there's a case. There are cases where one hand becomes tamei. So we say that in the case of truma, chaverta tahira, the second hand, your other hand, still remains tahar, which means one hand became impure. If I touch something else with my other hand, it doesn't make that other thing tamei. Only one of my hands becomes tamei. But with regards to kodesh, matgol shteyan, you've got to go and immerse both of your hands, even though you only touched one of your hands, meaning one of your hands came into contact with tumah. Again, this is the rabbanon, tumah derabanan. Shahayad metames chaverta b'kodesh, because the principle is that one hand makes the other hand tamei with regards to kodesh. Aval loy b'truma, but we do not apply this stringency with regards to truma. One hand becoming tamei in the case of truma does not make the other hand tamei. Now, another stringency is as follows: Oichlin, oicholim, neguvin, biyadayim musabois b'truma. Here's the thing: we mentioned this before, that when you talk about something contracting tumah, you first have to be machsher it. You have to prepare it to now be susceptible to contracting this impurity. And how do you do that? You wash it, or it comes into contact with one of these liquids, right? Purposely so, right? We said that there were 7 liquids: it was honey, and wine, and milk, and water, and so on. All these different liquids, right? In order for it to become, in order for it to then contract impurity. What happens if you have over here some food that has never come into contact with any kind of liquid for the purpose of making it susceptible to be makabel tumah? So now my hands are tamei. Am I allowed to eat this? Am I allowed to eat this food? Because even though I touch it with my hands, right, it doesn't contract any tumah. So can I eat it? So we say the answer is that with truma, you can do that. You can pick it up with your hands and you can eat it because it doesn't contract the tumah. Not in the case of kodesh, as the Gemara will explain. The reason is there's something very special about kodesh. We say chibas kodesh machshartai, that the cherishedness of kodesh is what makes it prepared to receive to receive tumah, and that it can be susceptible to tumah. In other words, it doesn't need the special requirement of being in contact with some kind of liquid first. The fact that it is kodesh is enough to make it prepared for it to become susceptible to tumah. Here we go over to Daf Chof Aleph, Amud Aleph. We talk about now another stringency with which we apply only to truma and not to kodesh. We're talking about somebody who's one of his 7 close relatives passed away, and it's before that the person, before the deceased is buried. Now, obviously, we're not talking about somebody who actually touched the body. We're talking about somebody who has now received the status of einin because one of his relatives passed away, right? What's the law with regards to einin? The law with regards to oinen is that he's not allowed to partake in kachim. He's not allowed to eat any kachim while he's in the state of an oinen, right? And also, kippurim, somebody who is lacking, he still needs the carbon in order for him to become tahar. In other words, he's gone through the mikvah. He's gone through everything he needs to do to become pure. He's just waiting to offer up his sacrifice, and then he will be completely ready to consume any food from kachim, right? So we say, even though technically this person hasn't come into contact with any tumah that would prevent him from eating kachim. However, he, for whatever reason, was unable to qualify to eat kachim. Before he goes and eats kachim now, you require an extra immersion to be able to eat kodesh. Perhaps, the way I understand this is that there's an aversion of his concentration from protecting himself from tumah. He's averted his mind from it because he knows I can't eat kachim either way, right? If somebody passes away, a relative passes away, that person says to themselves, look, I can't eat kachim now anyway. So who says I have to be that careful to ensure that I don't even become a revi to tumah, right? Or with the mechusar kippurim, even though he's gone to the mikvah, and maybe after he brings his carbon, he will be able to eat kachim, but so long as he hasn't brought up the carbon, right, he may not have as much sensitivity to that tumah because technically he does not qualify to eat it. So therefore we say that he needs to go and immerse his hair. He needs to have a tefillah again in order to be able to eat kachim. Avalei truma, we don't apply that extra stringency when it comes to truma. And that is the end of the Mishnah. Any questions before we go on? Okay, so now we're going to come along and look at all of these things, right? So the first stringency that we mentioned was that what? You can put one vessel into another vessel in order to immerse it and make them both pure, only for truma, but you cannot do that if you are using these kelim for kodesh. So this is the Gemara, the beginning of Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. The Gemara starts like this: Kodesh. In the case of Kodesh, my time alloy. Why did we say that you cannot immerse one keli inside of another? And for the Gemara, Rabbi Ilah says, because the weight of one vessel will serve as a separation between the water and the second vessel, and so therefore it won't be a valid immersion. Frank the Gemara, if that's the case, if the reason why you have one particular case that we mentioned about a chatzitza where one weighs against the other, if you're going to say the problem in the first case was chatzitza, when we say at the end, right, that you're not allowed to tie a knot, right, it seems also to be for the same reason, the same concern of a chatzitza. So Reisha la mishum chatzitza. If the end of the Mishnah talks about a case like tying a knot or the water, right? It's all talking about chatzitza. Why would we mention the beginning of the Mishnah also something that the concern would be about chatzitza? In other words, why would we learn the same thing twice? The Ketani Sefer, we learned in the Sefer of the Mishnah, unlike the rule of Kodesh is the rule of truma sheba kodesh mate or menagiv or matbil v'achakach kosher. Because in the case of kodesh, one has to untie the knots, he has to dry it, and then he can immerse the garment, and then only afterwards he can retire the knots. But we said, truma kosher v'achakach matbil. But in the case of truma, he can tie the knots loosely, and then he can immerse the garment. So now, this special chumrah, right, of kodesh is clearly to do with chatzitza. So then maybe we're going to have to assume that the Mishnah's first case is it's not about chatzitza. If not, why mention both cases? So, and for the Gemara, Reisha, the Seifa, Mishum Chatzitza. The truth is, the Reisha, the cases that we mentioned, the Reisha is because of Chatzitza, one vessel inside of the other, and the Seifa is also because of Chatzitza. But guess what? We need both cases. Why do we need both cases? It's not as if we only need one group of cases and we didn't need the other. The reason why we need it is as follows. We needed the E Ashme'inon Reisha, because if we only mention the first part of the Mishnah, which is the vessels inside of the vessels, then Hava Amina, I would have thought, Hainu Taima de la Kodesh Loi, that the reason you're not allowed to immerse it within another for Kodesh is Mishum Kvedoi Shel Kli the Ika. It's only because of the weight of the inner vessel that's there, which makes the Chatzitza. So it's the actual weight of the vessel that I'm concerned about. However, I will say in the end of the Mishnah, where you're talking about a loose knot, where you don't have that same concern of the weight of one thing sitting on the other, the lekek kvedesha kli, so the case of the knot doesn't have something weighing down on it, then I might think that just like in Truma, a knot doesn't serve as a chatzitza because it doesn't. So too in the case of kodesh, it wouldn't be a chatzitza. Why wouldn't it be a chatzitza? The reason why it wouldn't be a chatzitza is because there's no extra weight. So that's why, if we'd only mentioned the first case in the Mishnah, I wouldn't automatically know the case of the knot. Now, what about the other way around? The Ashmein and Seifa. If the Mishnah would have only taught us the case of the knot in the garment, Hav Amina, then what might I have thought? I would have thought, the reason why I said that by Kodesh, this is not good and it doesn't count is Mishum, because, and here we go with the Daf Chof Aleph Amud Beis, we go to 21b, it's the Kitra B'maya Hadukti Mahadek, because a knot is tight in the water, right? That's what we're concerned of. Aval Reisha, but in the case of the Reisha, the Maya Akfuyin Makfilei, what happens? I would say, the Maya Akfuya Makfilei Lemona, since the water actually causes this vessel to float a little bit, is Loihava Chatzitza, I might think that it wouldn't constitute a Chatzitza. Sericha, therefore, I need to have both cases. And therefore, what we ultimately can be satisfied with is that the reason why we say that by Kodesh you do not accept one vessel inside of another vessel is because of Chatzitza, and the difference between the Reisha and the Seifa is because the weight exists with regards to a vessel inside of a vessel, but it doesn't exist with regards to a knot, and the concern that we have with a knot in the Seifa is about it becoming tight inside the water, where you don't have that same concern with regards to the vessel inside of another vessel, which is why we need both. Now, if that's the case,
Rabbi.
See, yes?
Okay, so when we do tefillah over here, for example, in the mikveh in our neighborhood,
yeah,
okay, it's true that the first vessel, especially if it's a ceramic vessel, when you put it in the water, it does float. And the only way you can get the tevilah to be complete is you actually have to push it down to go underwater.
Right.
Now, if you have two vessels, one inside the other, you have to push the first. I mean, your expectation is if I push both of them together, they still remain connected when they go underwater, and that's normally not.
That's correct.
It's normally not the case. So there will probably be a separation between the two, so that at some point both of them will be completely immersed without connection.
Right. That's correct.
So
why isn't it kosher? The answer is that the reason why it is kosher for truma is because, realistically speaking, that's not going to happen. And so therefore, it doesn't really serve as a chatzitza. But because we want you to be extra sensitive and extra conscientious when it comes to kodesh, we say we're not going to allow it in the case of kodesh, just in case a wild, far-fetched suspicion that maybe in this case it will remain weighing down on the lower vessel and serve as a chatzitza. But you're right. That's not usually what happens when you put a vessel into the mikvah. It's just we're saying we're making an extra stringency with regards to kodesh that we don't make with truma or chulin, etc. So, but you're right. Because if it would serve as a chatzitza, then why would it work for truma? Why would we be okay with it for truma? The reason why we're okay for truma is because realistically, it's not really a chatzitza. But we're worried that perhaps in some far-fetched scenario, it might serve as a chatzitza. Okay, but if this is the case, right, that the first part of the Mishnah, the Reisha, is talking about chatzitza, and the second part of the Mishnah is also talking about chatzitza, then it seems that there are not 11 stringencies, but there are only 10 stringencies that you have with kodesh over truma, because the first case in our Mishnah and the fifth case in our Mishnah seem to be more or less the same thing, right? We said the first case is a vessel inside of a vessel. The fifth case is tying a knot. Seemingly, they're the same concern, and therefore the same stringency. So therefore, there are only 10, not 11 different stringencies with regards to kodesh over truma. And that's what the Gemara comments over here. Rabbi Ilah, Rabbi Ilah, who explains that the special gezer the Chachamim made with regards to immersing vessels within another vessel is because of chatzitza, is consistent with his opinion. What's his opinion? He says a statement, the Amar Rabbi Ilah, Amar Rabbi Chanina bar Papa. Rabbi Ilah said in the name of Rabbi Chanina bar Papa that esem milus shanukan. Here in this Mishnah that we mentioned are 10 extra heightened standards that were decreed for Kodesh, but not for Truma. And he says, the first 5, Bein Kodesh, Bein Lechulin Shenasu Al Taras HaKodesh. They apply, these stringencies are applied by the rabbis both to actual Kodesh, meaning sacrificial food that was offered up as a carbon. It also applies, these stringencies applies for the chulin that were prepared to the level of stringency of Taras HaKodesh. That's the first 5. In the first 5 cases, the rabbis applied that also to the chulin of Taras HaKodesh. But the last 5 that are mentioned in the Mishnah is only La Kodesh. They only apply it to Kodesh, but not the chulin that were prepared on the standard of Kodesh. Now, why is that case? Why is that the case? It seems that the first cases were special enactments that the rabbis made because of a far concern that you might come to a tumah d'oraisa, right? So even though it's really only a tumah d'Rabbanan, but because they were concerned that you might come to a tumah d'oraisa, therefore they made this extra stringency. If that's the case, it's only with those 5 that they applied it not just to Kodesh, but also to chulin that was prepared to be the same level as Kodesh. But the last 5, which are only tumah the Rabbanon, and they will never come to become a Tumah Deraisa. It's not possible. So in those cases, we said that the Chumrah was only for Kodesh, but not applied to Chulin that was made al Taras HaKodesh. So now, my timer, what's the reason that the first 5 apply even to Chulin that were prepared according to the standards of Kodesh, whereas the last 5 don't? So he says, Chamish Kamaisa, the first 5 stringencies, the Islahu, Drara, the Tumah Midaraisa, which involve the concern of Tumah according to a biblical level of Tumah Gazrabu Rabbanan. So the rabbis decreed that Bein LaKodesh, Bein LaChulish, and Nasa Teres HaKodesh, whether you're talking about Kodesh or the regular food that was prepared according to the Tara of Kodesh, we are going to make this decree. But the last cases, the less Lahudurara, the Tumah Midaraisa, which did not involve the concern of contracting Tumah according to a biblical law. So we say, Gazur Buhu Rabbanon LaKodesh. The rabbis decreed for them only with regards to Kodesh, but L'chulish and Naswa Tarsa Kodesh, but with concerning Chulin that was prepared according to the standard of Kodesh, L'Gazur Barabanan, the rabbis did not make a decree. But according to Rabbi Law, there are only 10 cases because the first case and the 5th case are really the same. Okay, that's according to Rabbi Law. However, Rava doesn't agree with him. Rava comes along and he says, I can explain the Mishnah differently. There are actually 11. And the reason that you said that the Chachamim made the Gzeira for the vessel inside the vessel has actually nothing to do with weight. It's nothing to do with chatzitza, really. The last one does have to do with chatzitza, meaning when we're talking about the knot, that does have to do with chatzitza. But when it talks about a vessel inside a vessel, that doesn't have to do with chatzitza. Let's do it inside. Rava says, mid seifa have mishum chatzitza. With regard to the Seifa, the reason why they made these extra stringencies by Kodesh versus Truma is because of the concern of Chatzitza. But Reisha, la mishum Chatzitza. But the first case was not because of Chatzitza, because this concern of why should I need to mention 2 cases if we've already mentioned 1 case about Chatzitza at the end of the Mishnah, why would I be mentioning Chatzitza at the beginning of the Mishnah? So what's the reason then for the Reisha? What's the reason why one vessel inside of another vessel is not going to be good for Kodesh? For Reisha Haina Taima, what's the reason for the beginning of the Mishnah that you cannot put a vessel inside another vessel when you immersing it? Gezerah making a special enactment, rabbinic decree, because I'm worried that if a person is going to take one vessel and put it into another vessel, and I'm going to allow that with regards to Kodesh, then what is going to happen is you might come to take needles or spinning hooks and you're going to immerse them. You're going to put it into a vessel whose opening is not at least the size of a skin bottle's tube, like the leather bottle's tube, which means like this. You have a bottle, right? Let's say the bottle is big enough, right, to hold a whole bunch of needles, right? So you decide, I don't want the needles flying out, because then they're going to go to the bottom of the mikveh. I'll never be able to get it out. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to put it inside a vessel or a bottle that has a very thin opening so that they're not going to come flying out, right? But now what happens is, we're going to consider your bottle to be a separate mikveh, okay? We're considering your bottle to be a separate mikveh. Keditznan, like we learned in a Mishnah, Eruv mikvois kishveferes hanoid. The mingling of mikvois In other words, when you want to put two mikvahs together, is accomplished through the connection of the size of a skins bottle's tube. Like the size of its thickness, and the size of its hole. Has to be a space that is measured with two fingers that can rotate. It means like this. When you have two mikvahs, right? What I mean by two mikvahs, you have one mikvah, which is kosher. It has the requisite amount of kosher mikvah water. And then you have next to it another pit, another bar, another mikvah that only has, let's say, 30 saw. Okay? Now, I want, for whatever reason, I want this mikvah of 30 saw to be kosher, but it doesn't have the right amount. So what I can do is I can combine the two mikvahs together by making a hole between the two walls, and then the waters mix with each other, and through mixing with each other, they become one mikvah. But in order for that to happen, there has to be what we call hashaka. There has to be kissing each other. They have to actually be connecting. But in addition to that, the hole that you're going to use to connect the two has to be at least the size of this shvayferes hanoid, which is, we say, the whole of the leather bottle's tube. And how big is that? It's 2 fingers, but it's not just 2 fingers, because you could put your 2 fingers into a space, but the fingers can't move. So that's not enough. It has to be a space that you can put your 2 fingers and rotate them completely, right? So there's like that circumference of those 2 fingers that can go completely around. That's how big it has to be. So now what are we trying to say? What we're trying to say is, when we, in the beginning of our Mishnah, said that you cannot take a vessel that you're going to use for Kodesh and put it into another vessel, and immerse them together, it's not because, like Reb Ilah said, that it's to do with the weight and the chatzitza that's going to possibly happen as a result of one vessel inside the other vessel, but rather we're worried that you're going to come to a conclusion that in the case of needles inside of a bottle, right, it would also be okay if it was less than the size of shveiferes hanoid, right? Because if you're able to put one vessel inside of another vessel, perhaps I won't be careful with the size of the opening of that vessel. To prevent a person from coming to such a mistake, the Chachamim made a special enactment that even in the case of a regular size vessel, which has an opening bigger than shveiferes hanoid, bigger than that size of the tube of a leather bottle, nevertheless, they said it's not going to be kosher. If that's the case, instead of having 10 different stringencies, like Rabbi Ilah said, because he made the first one and the 5th one to be the same concern, then ultimately what's happening is you have 11, because this is a different concern altogether. Okay? Everybody understand? Okay. So now, says the Gemara, and Savala, Rava holds, like the statement of Rav Nachman, that he said in the name of Rabbi Ba'avuha. What does he say? He says, excuse me, Achas Esrei Milas Shalukan. We taught over here that there are 11 different stringencies, that muchumras that were made over here. Sheish Rishonis. The first 6 apply. Bein lekodesh, bein lechulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. The first 6 apply both to kodesh and things that were prepared al taras hakodesh, but acharonos, the last 5 apply only to kodesh. The last ones apply only to kodesh. But they do not apply to the chulin that was prepared on this level of the standard of kodesh. Okay, so far so good.
A rabbi.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the mikvahs, I guess it's worth pointing out that some have it where the two mikvahs are adjacent to each other, and others have it where one's on top of the other.
Right. So that's interesting that there are different opinions with regards to a mikvah, that the actual bar that you're going into isn't the pit that has the kosher mikvah water, but rather you are entering into a mikvah that is connected to a mikvah that has the rainwater. Because I don't know if you've ever seen the original mikvah, right, that has the rainwater. It sometimes is not as clean as the mikvah that you go into when you're going into a mikvah, right? Because rainwater might not be as you know, attractive as the water that you can constantly take and pump out and bring in new water constantly. I mean, in the different mikvahs that we go to, right, they keep changing the water quite often, right? The rainwater, you don't change that often because it's not so simple to be able to collect the right amount of rainwater in the correct way. It's very complicated. The laws of mikvah are very complicated laws, and there are so many things that can invalidate the rainwater from being used as water for a mikvah that as much as possible we try to not change the rainwater if we don't have to, right? So therefore, what happens is there has to be a connection between the actual mikveh that you're going into and the body of water that's holding the 40 saw of rainwater. By the way, I mean, one of the ways to collect this water is you get a lot of snow, and they've done that. I know a particular case that they did recently where they brought a whole load of snow to be able to put it into a mikvah and allow it to defrost, and then it becomes kosher for a mikvah. But be that as it may, the question is, when you want to connect the one mikvah to another mikvah, does it have to be from the side, or does it have to be from on top of the other? So we know that the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, was very particular to have a mikvah which is bar al gabe bar, one pit on top of the other. That's literally what it means. Where the bottom mikvah, which has the rainwater, is where you store that rainwater, which is a kosher mikvah, and the water that's in the top mikvah, right, is the one that's connecting through a hole down below. It connects the two mikvahs together. Others, however, maintain that no, it needs to be from the side, and so the two mikvahs will be made in tandem with one another, like one next to the other. But be that as it may, there would be no difference between bar al gabi bar and bar al tzad bar with regards to the minimum requirement of how big that hole needs to be that connects the two. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a review of what we've learned so far. The daf is
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
When the mikveh is one on top of the other,
Yeah.
the top mikveh is producing pressure on the bottom mikveh.
Okay.
So it means that the waters in the bottom mikveh, the walls of the bottom mikveh, must withstand the pressures of the top and the bottom waters.
Okay.
Whereas side by side, that's not the case. There's only one wall, for example, that might be common to both of them.
Right.
And assuming that they're the same height, etc., then in the second case where they're side by side,
yeah,
you may have less of a problem with water seeping out through the walls.
Right. I hear you. Yes.
Okay. So I understand Chabad does it their way, but what do they do to ensure that you do not have the kind of seepage that I'm talking about when the mikvahs are top to bottom?
So, I mean, I cannot tell you from experience because I haven't really been involved in making a mikvah. However, I'm a guesstimating over here that there would be special reinforcements made before you put the water in to ensure that that doesn't happen. There must be certain insulation that's going to take place before you do that, taking into consideration exactly the concern that you just mentioned, that there's going to be extra pressure, and so therefore you want to insulate it to the point that it can withstand that kind of pressure. I'm not sure exactly what they do, but that's what I would imagine. I would imagine that they take your concern seriously, and therefore they prepare it accordingly. That's what
When you say one on top of the other,
yeah.
Are you saying physically one on top of the other, or are they offset so that there's a tzinor on a slant from the top mikveh to the bottom mikveh?
It means that there's a hole at the bottom of the mikveh that you're immersing into that directly goes and connects with the water that's in the lower mikveh. Yeah. It's not through a pipe. It's not through a pipe.
What I'm saying is that if they were, well, let me see if I can get my hands so that you can see them.
Yeah.
If they are like this, you're talking side by side is like this.
Right.
I'm talking about if one is like that, and then there's a pipe that connects between the two of them like that.
That's not what it's talking about. What it's talking about is here's the top mikvah and here's the bottom mikvah, and so there's a hole over here somewhere on the floor of this top mikvah. There's a hole, and it's connecting the water between the top mikvah to be actually touching the water right underneath it. That's my understanding of how it works, and that's what there are times where if I can find the hole, I just make sure that there's water. I put my foot down there, just make sure, yep, it's there. The water's there. That's my understanding of how it works. There's actual kissing, one below the other, not slanting sideways, but right underneath. So let's do a little bit of a recap of all the things that we've learned today. We said that there are 11 or 10, depending who you go, according to different stringencies that you have with Kodesh over Truma, that you make these extra stringencies with regards to Kodesh and not Truma. One is putting a vessel in another vessel. The other is that we said that when you touch any part of the vessel, whether it's the handle, the inside or the outside, with regards to Truma, only the part that you touch becomes tamei. Whereas by Kodesh, the whole thing becomes tamei. We said the third thing was somebody who's carrying in one hand a midras, which is something that became tamei by somebody wearing it, so like a zav who wears a shoe. So if you take that shoe, you can, with the other hand, you can carry truma in an earthenware vessel, because we're not worried about the wine in that other barrel becoming tamei, whereas for Kodesh we say we do have that extra concern. The fourth thing we said was the clothes of somebody, excuse me, the clothes of somebody who's careful with truma will become a midras for somebody who wears Kodesh. We said then the next thing is that with regards to tying a knot, that you have to release the knot, and then you also have to dry that particular garment that you want to immerse, and then only afterwards can you immerse it, and then you could retie a knot. Whereas when it comes to truma, we said that you don't, first of all, it doesn't need to be released, and you could even in fact make a loose knot, and you do not have to dry it first. You can immerse it just as it is. We're not worried and concerned about a potential chatzitza. We also said that with regards to a vessel that you're completing, and then before you complete it, you start to have in mind to guard it from any kind of impurity, we say that's enough for Truma. But for Kodesh, you would have to actually go and immerse it, because we have a distant suspicion that perhaps it would still nevertheless contract Tuma, as we explained with whether if there was some wetness left over from a zog or a nida, then maybe that would once again make this vessel tame once it does become a complete vessel. But we don't have that concern with regards to truma. Then the seventh thing we said was that when you are carrying a vessel with a whole bunch of different items of fruit or whatever it might be, we say that when it comes to Kodesh, that basket actually makes it all one and the same. And so if one thing becomes tummy, everything else becomes tummy. With Truma, we don't say that. It's only the thing that it touched. The next thing we said is that we say only with regards to Kodesh that the Revi becomes puzzle, whereas by Truma we say it can only become Shlishi. And we also said that with regards to Truma, if one of your hands become Tameh, the other doesn't become Tameh. Whereas when it comes to Kodesh, we say you have to immerse both of your hands, even if only one of your hands became Tameh. And we said that number 10 or 11 is that number 10 is with regards to eating food that has not yet become susceptible to Tumah with hands that are Tameh is okay with Truma, but it's not okay with Kodesh. And we said the reason for that, the Mishnah doesn't say this, but says later on, the reason is because what's called Chibas Kodesh Machshartai, the cherishness of the fact that it is Kodesh makes it now prepared to be susceptible for Tuma. And the 11th thing we said was with regards to an Oinain. This is somebody who one of his 7 relatives passed away and is not yet buried, and somebody who's Mechus Kippurim because they cannot consume Kodshim, right? At that particular moment, we say once they now become eligible to consume Kodshim, they would then have to require Tefillah, but we wouldn't say the same with regards to Truma. This is an extra stringency. Obviously, if an Oinain or Mechus Kippurim came in to contact with known Tuma, even the Rabbanon, then they would have to remove that Tuma for Truma as well. We're talking about where they're not aware of coming into contact with Tuma, but because they weren't eligible to consume the Kodshim, therefore they would when they become eligible, they have to once again immerse to be able to eat Kodshim. Then we came along and we asked, what's the reason for the first stringency? One vessel inside of another vessel, and we said that according to Rabbi Law, it's because of the weight. Whereas the Seifa, when we talk about a chatzitza, we say the reason why in the Seifa it's no good is because we're worried about the tightness of the knot, whereas we don't have that concern with regards to the Resha, and vice versa. When it comes to the knot, we're not worried about the weight, whereas in the beginning we are worried about the weight, and that works well with Rabbi Law's position that there are only 10 categories, 5 which we apply to Kodesh, and also we equally apply to chulin that were prepared on the level of Kodesh, whereas the last 5 of the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Law, the last 5 do not apply to chulin al taras hakodesh. And we explain the reason is because anything that was able to get to a level where it could become Toma, the Araisa, the Chachamim made a gezerah even for chulin al taras hakodesh, whereas things that weren't able to, they didn't. And then we have finally, we had Rava who said no. Actually, the reason for the first one is because we make a takana. We make a takana for not being able to put needles into a a vessel that has an opening less than Shveferes Hanoid, which is 2 fingers which is the size of 2 fingers that can rotate completely. And we brought the case of the mikvah to show that that is indeed the halacha with regards to connecting one mikvah to another mikvah. And this is where we'll stop. And I wish you all a wonderful Shabbos. And we will see you all Be'ezus Hashem, same time, same place on Sunday. Be'ezus Hashem.
Rabbi, question.
Thank you, Rabbi.
When you're when you're saying a knot, what kind of material are we talking about?
Say that again.
When you're saying, something that's tied with a knot,
Yes.
what kind of material are we talking about for the knot?
I'm assuming it's a cloth, a garment, that it's part of the garment, and the style that is being used is one that it has these taking the ends and making a knot with it. So you've got to untie that knot in order to be able to immerse it into the mikvah to be a valid immersion. So what obviously it's got to be a cloth that can be makabel tumah. Otherwise, why are you immersing it? But
wouldn't water? I mean, water would penetrate the cloth and the knot itself.
For that very reason, we say that it's okay for truma. We're making an extra stringency to bring.
Okay, so you're saying the stringency for Kodesh is basically the reason why we're doing that.
That's correct.
In this case.
That's correct. It's
okay.
only for Kodesh.
Rabbi.
Okay, I understand. Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Yes. Rabbi, it's basically just to imply it's more machmir. There's more of a stringency involved than it is anything else. That's more the emphasis than the actual theory.
It's to create a heightened sense of awareness. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi.
All the best. Have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
See you.